welcome. My name is Janita Bacalasa. I'm an activist from Bolivia, and I also work at the Human Rights Foundation. It's an honor for us to hold this panel in partnership with the City of Oslo as part of our program called Defending the Defenders. Through this program, HRF is able to support the work of brave environmental activists across the world who are facing up to authoritarian regimes in order to protect the world's flora and fauna. Defending the Defenders was first launched in 2019 at the Oslo Freedom Forum, the global human rights event that the Human Rights Foundation holds annually in Oslo, Norway. We are excited to bring this conversation to RightsCon because the killing of indigenous leaders and environmental activists across the world in order to cover up environmental crimes and silence whistleblowers is very commonplace at this point in history, and something must be done in order to stop this. Personally, as a young Bolivian activist, I've experienced the risk of working for defending the environment in authoritarian regimes. Last year, when Bolivia faced an environmental crisis, many of us activists were heavily persecuted by the Bolivian government because we dared to speak up in defense of our forests. The Bolivian government had just legalized the use of fires in forest areas in order to expand agro-cattle territory, since my government had made a deal with the Chinese government that we were going to be exporting high amounts of beef in a quantity that Bolivia had never produced before. As a result, over 5 million hectares of forest were lost, as well as the lives of many firemen. This is why we must understand that human rights and environmental issues are not separate issues, and they are both meant to be protected by the international community. Today, to lead this discussion, we have Melissa Matani, who is a member of the Oslo Freedom Forum. She's a wonderful journalist and a social TV producer for CNN, and she will be leading us today as we speak to brave environmental activists who are currently protecting the humanity's most important source of life, Mother Earth herself. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Janice. It really is a pleasure for me to be a part of this really important conversation. Environmental activists, environmental journalists, and the work they do is more important than ever. And unfortunately, we are seeing less of it because it's increasingly dangerous as authoritarian governments feel more emboldened around the world. It was dangerous before the coronavirus pandemic hit, and in many cases is even more dangerous now. We're going to have a really interesting conversation about the intersection of digital rights and climate activism shortly. But first, I want to introduce you to Mark Owner. He's a Goldman Prize winner, and he's the founder of the environmental NGO Brain Forest. He led efforts to publicly expose the illegal agreements behind a huge mining project in his country. And he joins us now for a keynote speech. Mark?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure for me to speak today on this occasion. I'm proud to be a member of the Oslo Freedom Forum community, which connect me to a vast network of followers, activists, technologists, and journalists. It was part of the first Defending the Defenders panel discussion at the Oslo Freedom Forum in 2019. And I am happy to see that our community of environmental activists is expanding. I have absolutely resolutely engaged in environmental activism for a very simple reason. Almost 90% of my country, Gabon, is covered with forests. Protecting and sustainably managing this rich natural treasure should be the responsibility of our government. But we don't have democracy or the rule of law in Gabon. For nearly 60 years, Gabon has been ruled by a single family, from father to son. Those who criticize the government are arrested or thrown in jail. The internet and social media services are sometimes censored. Protecting the environment by taking a stand against this authoritarian regime is difficult and dangerous. For example, I myself was put in prison for taking a stand with my NGO Brain Forest, again, a mining project for one of the largest iron deposits in Africa. A Chinese company, in partnership with the government of my country, initiated the project with promises of economic growth and the creation of 3,000 jobs. However, this project endangered a nature reserve which includes Congo and Mingoli Falls. These falls are classified among the most beautiful in Central Africa. For taking a stand against this project, I was subjected to a lot of harassment. The police raided my NGO's office. I was accused of waiting to overthrow the government and sabotaging the development of my country. The government came after my family. To combat illegal logging and other environmental crimes, my organization, Brain Forest Gabon, does independent forest monitoring. Before the occurrence of COVID-19 in March, we did this monitoring through both field visits and communicating with people in the forest, despite the poor state of roads and the digital gaps between the capital and the countryside. Since the lockdown restriction imposed by government, the internet and digital tools have become essential for us to continue our activities. We are gradually adapting to the new situation with the help of our partners, such as the Environmental Investigation Agency, which is training us to use innovative digital tools to collect real-time information on illegal activities in the forest. This type of partnership is crucial for us in this period, especially because it integrates the classic elements of our way of working with the innovative system and will also allow a better flow in information. In order to continue defending the environment, we need our support to defend our digital rights and access to a free and open internet. We also need technology partnership to use innovative digital tools to expose environmental crimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you for the tireless work that you continue to do. So we're very lucky to be joined today by activists from all different regions of the world who I hope are going to be joining us now. We have Evgenia Chirikova. She is also a Goldman Prize winner. Let's see if hopefully she can come up on your screens. She is originally from Russia, but she's now living in exile in Estonia. I'm told that she's not with us yet, but hopefully she will be with us in a moment. I do know that we have Peter Schwartzstein with us. He's an environmental journalist and non-resident fellow at the Center for Climate Security. He has worked extensively in the Middle East with a deep focus on water security, which is, there he is, a very important topic facing the world right now. And he recently spoke to dozens of activists for a piece he wrote about the authoritarian war on environmental journalism, a very, very timely article. I will let you know when we are going to be joined by hopefully Evgenia and also Ariel Ruiz Urquiola, who's a Cuban biologist who might be joining us. But for the moment, Peter, since I have you, I want to talk to you a little bit just about coronavirus. I was saying before that the work that journalists do is so important and increasingly dangerous. It was hard to do before the pandemic in terms of getting access to sites, actually trying to get access to data to find out what the government is doing. And in many cases, that's 10,000 times harder. With all of your experience in the Middle East, what's been your experience during this pandemic? Peter, just hang on a second. We can't hear you.
Sorry. All right, I'm back now.
You're back.
Thank you very much
Wonderful.
for having me. No, I mean, as kind of much of the world has, of course, found in the last few months, COVID has turned everything upside down, and environmental journalism is unfortunately very far from an exception. On a purely practical level, kind of an inability for journalists, and particularly environmental journalists, to actually access many of the places that we're writing about has been an absolute nightmare. And this is not just a kind of a problem for those who sort of fly around the place, such as the severity of many of the lockdowns that have been implemented over the course of the last few months, that even journalists based in capitals or regional centers across the Middle East and North and East Africa have been unable to kind of reach many of these often isolated, distant areas in which a lot of the worst abuses are taking place. So on that kind of logistical basis, this has been an absolute nightmare. And on a practical kind of perhaps a sort of more sort of journalistic level, the very fact that the pandemic has just come to completely consume the world, and by extension journalism, over the last 5 months has sort of pushed climate change and other environmental problems off the front pages at a point when it kind of, for those of us in the kind of environmental journalism community, it really felt like we were beginning to establish some real momentum. It's not that there's ever a good time for a global pandemic, but this was a particularly bad one. And then just one final little point. I mean, the nature of kind of many of the worst environmental abuses is such that kind of a pandemic style lockdown is an absolute boon for kind of a lot of these sort of repressive government and irresponsible corporate folks who are presiding over a lot of the worst damage. So again, for journalism and media and conservationism at large, this has been a disaster. But for those of us on this beat in particular, it's been extremely difficult to work around.
And you know, what you were just saying is so interesting. I also feel like there was a moving momentum in terms of climate journalism. We saw last year, for example, there were the global climate strikes. This year, before the pandemic hit, the rise of Greta Thunberg, which was getting lots of young people interested. And it just felt that even online, there was just this momentum behind the climate and people's awareness. And I feel that that has completely waned, partly because people are so concerned about other things, you know, their health. Obviously, sometimes, especially in some of the poorer countries, people just struggling to make ends meet. So the climate has shifted. But you know, we have to be quite honest, this is also a very strategic attack by authoritarian governments to get the climate out of the limelight. Would you agree?
I certainly would. And I mean, unfortunately, as we've seen in the last few months, it's not just purely sort of recognizable authoritarian governments. The Trump administration, Bolsonaro's Brazil, and an array of other countries that we wouldn't necessarily automatically associate with authoritarianism also appear to have sort of taken advantage of the kind of all-encompassing distraction that is the pandemic to kind of loosen environmental regulations, to force through various measures that in the US's case have impeded folks looking to protest against fossil fuel pipelines. So this has been exceedingly difficult, and it's just a kind of an extension of kind of a problem that environmentalists and kind of everybody throughout the kind of environment-related world has been dealing with in recent years. There's the idea that sort of development and sort of growth and environmental protection are kind of sort of almost opposing forces. And so if one has a country in which there's like a particular clamor for new jobs, in which authorities are often extremely fearful of the possibility of kind of or underemployed youth, those are the instances in which states and governments and regimes often kind of go out of their way to kind of crush those who might look to defend the environment. So what the pandemic has done in crushing kind of economic growth to an even greater extent than we'd seen previously, is most likely to kind of fuel an even kind of more accelerated government bid to kickstart economies once the disease has waned somewhat.
And, you know, so we have seen also, I suppose, that one of the trying to be positive here, with everybody stuck at home, you are seeing more people search out, you know, articles on the internet or trying to look. I mean, it's kind of one of the things that you said. Obviously, people are looking for jobs and people are looking for food. But then on the other hand, they have actually seen like what can happen to nature around them. You know, when you're inside, you're longing to be outside, and you're kind of appreciating those things more. Have you seen like a difference in how the climate is perceived in some of the different countries that you've worked in? Because you've written extensively about like Egypt, for example, and North Africa, but equally, you know, your work extends to other areas in the world. Have you seen any similarities or differences that you would point out through regions or specific countries in the way that they handle this?
One of the things that's most perhaps arresting about talking to sort of farmers and fishermen and sort of regular urbanites throughout much of kind of North and East Africa and the Middle East, my kind of usual areas of work, and occasionally further afield, is that you don't get people sort of Republican Party style climate change denialists. Like the fact that something is going horribly wrong with the climate and with the environment at large is rather kind of blatantly obvious to everyone, even if they can't necessarily articulate the concept of climate change in the terms that scientists might. So that's a kind of a really quite, I guess, in-your-face illustration of how fast and how dramatically things are changing. I'll give you an example. In parts of Sudan, kind of various villages that I've been visiting on and off kind of over the past 3 or 4 years, the desert Sahara sands are advancing at a speed of up to a few hundred meters a year. So when you already have this kind of very thin little belt of greenery either side of the Nile, and it's getting kind of eaten away at a pretty fearsome pace by the desert, you are in no way going to be sort of denying that something is horribly amiss. The problem, of course, is that many of these people lack political agency to make their concerns heard. And in many countries in which governments are up against a sort of fearsome array of conflicts and financial crises, often, understandably to a certain extent, these things get kind of buried amid other concerns. Yeah, there's one of the consistent threads, however, is that kind of fairly broad perception that global environmental conditions are spiraling out of control.
You know, it's so ironic because it's like when you talk about it in those terms, and it's literally like, it's almost a matter of life and death in some countries, you know, or national security, depending on what you're talking about, whether it's Sudan or whether it's food security or whether it's water security. It just seems to me that these leaders would benefit so much from trying to actually protect their country's biodiversity, protect their country's natural resources. And in some ways, it would be a hero to their own people. And the fact that they are so eager to kind of crush these movements or crush the information in the people who are trying to get this information out, it's just, you know, crazy. I mean, let's just take a step back and assess why they're so reluctant to act and why they're so eager to crush these movements. Do you think it is money? Do you think it's power, or do you think it is a mixture of both?
Well, yeah, I mean, you've hit on what is perhaps the single most frustrating thing about the entire crackdown on the conservation movement globally, which is that it doesn't really make sense. Like, the environment ought to be an issue that kind of cuts across ideology, that cuts across all sorts of other political cleavages. It ought to be an area where kind of otherwise controversial politicians ought to be able to really set themselves apart. But I mean, the very fact that we're here is an illustration of a different reality. As to why that happens, well, of course, it differs somewhat from region to region, to country. But for the most part, it's a kind of potent combination of money, of power, and of horribly misplaced priorities. From a financial perspective, even though inordinately large numbers of people, generally majorities, throughout a lot of the kind of hardest hit countries in Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia and Latin America, realize that things are going wrong, many of those at the kind of real centers of power have either vested financial interests with a lot of the kind of deeply polluting industries like fossil fuels or mining or logging or agribusiness. And as a consequence, they're among that kind of narrow minority that often do have a serious financial interest in maintaining this sort of polluting fossil fuel burning status quo. And then there's the power element, which is that a lot of kind of authoritarian governments are deeply distrustful of the idea of citizens kind of coalescing around a particular issue, no matter what that issue is. And so for most of the last few decades, with plenty of exceptions here or there, the environmental movement in the Middle East and North and East Africa was seen as like a bunch of harmless tree huggers. And as a consequence, they largely escaped a lot of the kind of worst treatment dished out to other forms of civil society activists. But as the environment has been kind of deteriorating at this kind of ever more rapid speed, as climate change is just hitting home harder and harder, a lot of these governments, like those of Iran and Egypt and elsewhere, have kind of slowly woken to the fact that, well, these supposedly harmless tree huggers, from their perspective, are actually sort of messengers or sort of emissaries of a potentially destabilizing political force. And so it's the kind of oldest trick in the book, they shoot the messengers. And then the final thing is that, I mean, as unfortunately we know, and this is true not just of countries throughout a lot of the developing world, but in Europe and East Asia and in the US as well, a lot of politicians just seem, by nature perhaps of their age or by nature of just being slightly blinkered folks, unaware of the extent of the environmental damage out there. One of the problems, of course, on a global level is that a lot of the real kind of power brokers, whether they be in media or finance or in politics, are in cities that are often spared some of the worst kinds of environmental damage, as opposed to the sorts of issues that farmers and fishermen in more rural areas experience. So in some instances, there's just a pure ignorance on the part of those in power, as jarring and unlikely as that might sound.
You know, it was interesting because you just gave a great example of how in some of the countries that you covered, there aren't climate deniers like you're seeing here in the GOP party, but because the evidence is just there for all to see. But you still see this rise of fake news that's just meant to weaken these people who are, as you said, a destabilizing force to the people in power. Now, in certain countries that you covered, you know, these mobile networks aren't that strong. I don't think in Sudan, for example, they have, it's not like every single person has a phone like they probably do in Egypt or in Dubai, for example. But are you still seeing the spread of fake news there as big of a threat as it is in some countries like it is here in the US, for example?
I mean, in general, yes. Within the sort of environmental sphere, it's harder to say. I mean, as concerned as so much of the public is about kind of deteriorating urban air quality or kind of extreme new kind of summer highs in rural areas, when you have so many other issues in front of you, kind of environment, understandably, perhaps hasn't yet assumed quite the sort of rhetorical importance that it ought to. So as a consequence of that sort of diminished rhetorical significance, it's not yet as polarizing a topic as it may very well soon be, and in a way that it sort of is in other parts of the world. However, one of the very interesting ways in which I'd say fake news within the kind of environmental sphere is beginning to kind of seep into to the discourse is, well, because kind of so much of the developing world, particularly Africa, has contributed to such a meager extent to climate change. This is, as we know, a predominantly kind of Western and East Asian phenomenon or responsibility, because most of these countries in Africa, for example, have contributed such a meager share to global carbon emissions, there's sometimes a kind of temptation to use climate change, this kind of big global phenomenon that's beyond the control of local politicians, as a kind of foil for their own failures. So I'll give you an example. In Nigeria, within a lot of the sort of conflict resolution community, there's a certain unease at the extent to which authorities are blaming climate change for violence in the country's northeast, Boko Haram. We know it to be sort of part of the equation. We know it to be one of the key reasons why sort of farmer-herder conflict and jihadism are continuing to spiral there. But it's only one, and it's kind of been talked up to far too great an extent by government and by government-affiliated media, because it's a useful way of deflecting from their own failures and their own kind of contributions to that conflict. So that's just a little snapshot as to how a different form of kind of climate-related fake news can play out.
It's really interesting, and it's really interesting just to hear about your knowledge and your experience in all of these different countries, which give us such different sort of case scenarios of how the climate is almost being weaponized. What about Facebook? I mean, you know, we had Mark Zuckerberg here testifying on the Hill, and I'm just interested, is Facebook seen as a spreader of fake news or as a tool for the environment in some of the countries where you are? I also apologize, that is just a doorbell, but this is what happens when you go online from home.
Yes, no, I'm waiting for all sorts of bangs and whistles in the background in my apartment. Again, it's somewhat hard to say, purely because the environment doesn't yet have the importance and by extension the sort of, I guess, power to polarize that perhaps it ought to. They're in a from an environmental perspective, perhaps a few years away from climate change being the kind of lightning rod issue that unfortunately it so often is in Europe and America and a number of other parts of the world. However, because kind of climate and environmental activists within the Middle East are very slowly beginning to sort of mobilize in real numbers, and because Facebook within the Middle East, for example, is extremely popular and like a prime means for mobilizing kind of large groups in countries in which protest is often deterred, there are all sorts of kind of mutterings about kind of government and security service infiltration of environment civil society groups in places like Iraq. There's an excellent Baghdad-based water campaigning group called Save the Tigris, which has done excellent work in trying to draw attention to the desperately sad and depressing state of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Iraq. And there have certainly been a number of instances in which they believe, I think with good reason, that some of their kind of Facebook organized events have been sort of sabotaged from within by security, Iraqi security affiliated folks. So kind of as things stand, I think social media hasn't yet, from an environmental perspective, become the perhaps negative force that it has in many other domains. But I fear that as sort of environmental issues continue to gain in sort of popular interest, that scenario might change.
And so with the coronavirus pandemic, you know, it's only going to get worse in some of these countries in Africa, for example, in the Middle East, because whereas, I mean, Africa especially is poorer and it's not as equipped with its health facilities to deal with this kind of outbreak. How do you think that's going to affect environmental journalism going forward?
I mean, all of us are sort of flying by the seats of our pants at the moment, aren't we? It's just extremely hard to sort of plan more than a few days in advance, or even kind of have a decent sense as to what the pandemic kind of state in various countries will be even a week in advance. However, one of the unfortunate trends that I and many others within the kind of environmental journalism and wider environmental world fear is a kind of continuing crackdown on perhaps the single most vulnerable bunch of environmental journalists and environmental activists, and that's those who actually operate in the most rural and the most distant parts of their countries. From an environmental journalism angle, the single most victimized and harassed bunch of journalists are those who work for kind of small town newspapers or small town TV outlets or blogs within kind of rural parts of India and Indonesia and Iran and places like that. They lack the sort of protection of the kind of human rights community at large that's often centered in kind of capitals and other major urban centers. They often, of course, live with their families at the mercy of local bosses, of local political types, of major and powerful corporations, many of which are kind of deeply in bed with those political players. And so when the dust ultimately settles, when kind of we're finally able to sort of come up for air and examine the kind of environmental fallout from COVID, I and many others have a very big fear that kind of particularly vulnerable subset of conservationists might have been hit extra hard, kind of in that sort of relative news blackout and vacuum that's existed in a lot of these places over the last 5 months.
So as an environmental journalist who has worked in all of these countries, what keeps you up at night? What is the biggest fear or the biggest challenge that you think is facing the climate right now?
I mean, for a moment to be sort of, on a macro level, to be sort of stunningly unoriginal, it's the speed at which fossil fuels continue to be burnt and will almost certainly continue to be burnt over the following years. I mean, I mentioned that brief example of villages in Sudan that are finding their kind of relatively scarce greenery disappearing at the most extraordinary speed. That's the kind of scenario that's just playing out in so many of the world's kind of hardest hit landscapes, particularly the sort of hot, arid or semi-arid kind of middle latitudes. On a perhaps a slightly more manageable level, the sort of continuing and intensely sort of problematic volumes of kind of water and air pollution in many of these places are kind of maximizing the impact of climate stress. In Iraq, for example, where kind of rains have failed time and again over the past decade and a half, the kind of extraordinary amounts of agricultural and municipal and residential filth that pour into the Euphrates and Tigris rivers means that kind of much of whatever water is left over after those diminished rains is unusable for anything, even agriculture, and such as the kind of salinity of it, that it's sort of unusable for perhaps all but date palms, such as its filth that families sort of wouldn't deign to even clean their cars with it on occasion. So for as long as sort of air and water pollution continue to sort of exact as heavy a price as they continue to do in many places, that will just sort of add insult to injury as climate change bites. And then on a more sort of self-centered level, the crackdown on environmental defenders, whether they be in journalism like me or across the board, is worrying. Year by year, the number who are killed goes up. Year by year, the number who are pushed into exile or harassed or arrested or injured in perhaps failed attempts to kill kind of creeps up. And not enough is being done about it. I mean, if one looks at the cumulative total of environmental defenders killed last year and compare it to the sort of total number of human rights defenders who sadly also died over the course of their work, it's a really inordinate share, and yet it's attracted a kind of tiny fraction of the attention that its severity warrants. So if we continue like that, then there'll be sort of even fewer folks out there looking to sort of keep an eye on the worst environmental abuses. So all of that's got to change.
The scenario that you just outlined there is tragic. I mean, you know, we need people like yourself to to shed a light on what's actually happening so we can do something about it. And, you know, you're certainly right that not enough is being done about it, and more people are dying. What do we need to do to change attitudes to get more people interested? What can we do? What can the people who are watching this do?
Well, there's I guess the sort of the proactive and the reactive responses to that. The sort of proactive is just continuing to sort of push back against the idea that the environment is just sort of birds and bees and butterflies, as it was traditionally so often presented. And this is a rather a common line now, but like the environment is the water we drink, it's the air we breathe, it's the soil that grows the food that we eat. It's absolutely everything. So I mean, as a matter of complete urgency, we need to sort of get across the idea that the environment is a significantly more expansive area than most of us, I think, still appreciate. The perhaps slightly more depressing kind of answer to that, and unfortunately this is often a bit characteristic of my responses to these sorts of issues, is that a lot of the time I fear it will just take the kind of crisis, the kind of dislocation that we know climate change is going to bring, and that it already is bringing in many places, to really hammer home the stakes at play here to many of those in positions of power. And that's a depressing answer, because at the point at which a lot of these crises are staring you in the face, that's the point at which they're often too late to sort of fully address or fully mitigate, and certainly too late to address without lots of people suffering as a consequence. So, I mean, there is, or certainly prior to the pandemic, there was kind of a whole bunch of quite encouraging stuff, like kind of things as meager as article clicks on climate change or environment-related articles were continuing to soar. In the last few years, environment issues have kind of creeped their way from the back pages of newspapers right to the front much of the time. There is kind of positive news out there, and there are positive trends. We see that kind of young people in particular and others are significantly more concerned about climate change than previous generations, or even kind of themselves several years back. It's just a question of whether we can force through those changes at the necessary speed.
Well, what do you think is the role of the international community now in actually taking action? I mean, to your point, we were seeing some movement. We were seeing, you know, for example, the Paris Climate Agreement, which we don't know whether the US is really going to be a part of until after the election. So, I mean, you know, there's definitely been a shift, I think, in the global order, let's say, and therefore it's weakened a lot of these international institutions. What is their role now in trying to actually bring about some positive change?
To my mind, there are three big things that need to happen, and they're big, kind of at this point seemingly unattainable things, but things that we just need to get kind of working on at great rapidity. The first of which is that we just need to show kind of repressive states, those that are kind of cracking down on environmental journalists and environmentalists in general, that at the very least their actions will come at a cost, that they're noticed, that they're recognized. There's a very understandable tendency to sort of mock or belittle these sort of proverbial statements of concern coming from the State Department or the British Foreign Office or the European Commission. And while they're almost always insufficient, they're not nothing. Like the very idea, the very knowledge that kind of outside countries, including donor powers, are seeing and watching what's happened can sometimes be sufficient to sort of offer a degree of safety to those on the kind of front lines of all of this. The second thing is, I mean, one of the perhaps particularly unsavory trends over the last few years is the extent to which sort of repressive, or extent to which sort of corporations, particularly those engaged in those polluting industries like mining and kind of coal extraction and oil refining, the extent to which they've involved themselves in hounding or pursuing or sometimes killing environmental journalists or conservationists. Given that some of these companies, some of the worst offenders are themselves American or European, or at the very least have operations within North America and Europe, is sufficient or should be sufficient to give the international community a certain amount of leverage over them to kind of rein in that damage. And the final thing, and perhaps single most important thing, the thing that came up the most as I was kind of researching this most recent report that I did about the kind of global assault on environmental journalism, is kind of addressing media's sort of notoriously tortured finances. And while that's something that's extremely difficult to address, the fact that environmental journalism is seemingly suffering from even greater financial problems than media at large is a big issue. It's just sometimes not seen as the most sort of sexy or eye-catching of topics. Environmental investigations can be extremely expensive in a way that some kind of political coverage isn't. So I mean, finding a way to address that is significantly more difficult than articulating the problem. But yeah, environmental journalists are in many instances willing and able and ready to take on the risks that come with reporting this, but they can't do it if they haven't got any money.
You're so right, and it's a very good point, because it's not sexy, and that's not what you see, on the front page of newspapers. I mean, I have to say that there is a lot of depressing news out there, and it's very easy to just feel hopeless, when you hear about what's going on and you hear about, a lot of the things that are happening to climate activists, climate journalists. A lot of these people are our friends. But I will say that there's also a reason to be hopeful. I do think that, our future is with the next generation. And it's also very inspiring to see them be so passionate and care so much and try and change attitudes, because that ultimately does lead to putting more pressure on those in power. I remember last year, for example, at the UN, I marched with a lot of young people, and it was so inspiring. So just to wrap out of this, Peter, I mean, that's what keeps me hopeful. What keeps you hopeful?
This is a little bit too much of a doom monger. It is a risk when you talk to someone who covers the environment across the Middle East and parts of Africa. But you're right, there is some cause for optimism. Perhaps the first bit of which is the thing you just mentioned. Like, the younger generation is significantly more interested and significantly more motivated to tackle kind of climate and wider environmental woes than their predecessors.
So young people, if you're listening.
Yes. And while it's kind of become a little bit sort of stereotypical to sort of bring that up, a little bit unoriginal, it is true. And if there is any kind of real force for change, it's going to come from seemingly the under 40s for the most part. And the second thing is this: I am sort of uncharacteristically optimistic about the perhaps long-term consequences of the pandemic. It's felt, certainly from a climate and environment perspective, in the last few years, as if we've been kind of sleepwalking to our demise. Yes, attention has been on the up. Yes, there's been kind of a little more action here or there, but it's been kind of the equivalent of applying a Band-Aid to a gaping wound. And so I like to think that the kind of this shock, this realization that life can change in extraordinary ways in a very brief period of time, will be the shock, or perhaps the opportunity that we need to sort of radically rework our ways. I don't think it's going to happen in the short or medium or even relative long term. In that period, I think things will continue their rather unfortunate trajectory, but in the long run, I can see how this can be the spark that we need.
Well, Peter, I mean, the work that you do and the articles that you've written are so insightful, and we really appreciate the work you do, and we really need more people like you. And I would encourage that everybody that is watching, I just want to thank Peter, because we were supposed to have a panel of 3 people, but Peter has been our hero, and I think, you've been so interesting to speak to, and it's been interesting to actually just be able to spend a bit more time with you. And I would encourage others out there to read some of your articles and to get in touch with him and to really find out more and to support his work. So Peter, I really want to thank you for your time and for your patience. And Ariel, who is a Cuban biologist who was going to join us, but unfortunately couldn't, I believe that he has recorded a video message, which we will be able to play out. now, I believe. Okay, I'm told that we are we are being joined by Evgenia now, who is from Russia for a couple of minutes. She made it.
Yeah. Could you hear me, Melissa?
I can hear you. Thank you. I'm glad that you could finally make it. Your voice is so important, and we wanted to hear from you. But I do believe that I only have 2 minutes with you, so I'm going to have to ask you I'm glad you can join us anyway, but very quickly, want to just ask you, how has this coronavirus pandemic affected the work that you do and what you're hearing from journalists from Russia?
On my life, it's really very difficult to explain what the impact of coronavirus virus on my life, because it's changed all my life. For example, I cannot to speak with my friends, activists from Russia, because very often my friends from Russia to move to Estonia, where I located at this moment. But unfortunately, after pandemic problem, it was impossible, and I stay alone, and it's so difficult to observe your friends and activists only through computer. It's really difficult, but a situation with activism on Russia at this moment really very, very dangerous, because unfortunately Putin regime to use coronavirus pretext for new repressions against activists. And on Russia, it's really very, very difficult to organize any campaign and to protect rights of activists. And at this moment, you can find many information from Russia, from independent media, that it's really very difficult to organize environmental campaign or other types of campaigns. Activists on Russia have a problem with pressure from side of officials, and we have every day we get new and new information from Russia that new and new activists were arrested, and it's really very, very sad at this moment.
We don't have much time, so I just want to hear from you quickly. We talk about digital rights and these activists going online, but it's so hard in Russia because Putin has so much power. He can just flip a switch and he censors everything. He's just changed the constitution to give himself, in effect, even more power, if that were possible. So how are activists getting the word out where they are? This is exactly what I'm talking about to all the audience. She's just been silenced. Evgenia has left us. If we can get Evgenia back, then we will. Again, her voice and her story is very, very interesting, especially about her experience in Russia. But it just goes to show that for activists or journalists who are trying to get the word out online, it's not easy. There you are. You're back with us. I was just saying, with Putin giving himself more power, how hard is it for activists to get the word out now online? How are they communicating?
At this moment in Russia, we can observe a very horrible process, because after pandemic, Putin regime to use this pandemic problem for their interests, and they organize a very horrible process. They change constitution, and of course, its impact on all Russian society. And of course, people organize a huge campaign against this violation. And dozens of people were arrested. And at this moment, we can observe a lot of protest on regions of Russia. For example, at this moment, we have a huge protest on Khabarovsk, on far east of Russia. And methods of Putin's thugs, Putin bandits really horrible, because Putin regime to use against activists all tools. for example, propaganda machine works against activists and organize fake news about activity of Russian activists, and spread lie about activists. And of course, its impact for ordinary life of activists. And it's really very dangerous. For example, on Russia, it's really very dangerous to publish information on internet. And we have dozens of cases when people only publish information through information, and after that they have a problem and come to prison. And I think that we live on a fantastic time on Russia at this moment, because it's really very, very strange why it happens, but we have very big pressure from side of Putin authorities, but at the same time we have increasing number of protest groups on region. I think that it's impact of coronavirus, because people stay at home during many months and keep energy. And at this moment in Russia, we have a problem with economic crisis, and the Putin authorities try to get money from people and organize new and new horrible projects against people. And people decided to answer that and to organize protest. And you can observe protest on Bashkortostan, for example, on Tatarstan or Far East. And if you want to find more information about that, you can read information from our portal, aktivatika.org. Every day we check information about activism in Russia and spread this information, because we think it's really very important to give a voice for activists.
Absolutely, and that's one of the great things. I was introducing you at the beginning, but unfortunately you weren't there. But I was saying that you are now in exile outside of Russia because you became a thorn in Putin's side when you challenged some of the projects that he was doing. And now you're giving a voice to those others inside through your website, aktivatika.org. I want to just quickly ask you, I know we don't have much time, but what is it? I've had conversations with you, and we've been talking about the rise of fake news in Russia as Putin tries to weaken movements like this. But it's so encouraging to see that people are going out and protesting, and if anything, they're protesting more, which is great. That's a silver lining to the coronavirus pandemic. But the spread of fake news, how much of an issue is fake news, and specifically Facebook, to what's happening with the situation in Russia? It's been both a positive and a negative. What's your experience been?
Oh, it's really, really a very great question, because we try to check information with fake news about coronavirus. And for example, we have a lot of news from Russia. I mean, new fake news from propaganda machine, including fake news on Facebook and other social media about very good condition of Russian medicine and Russian hospitals, but it's not true. And ordinary activists work like volunteers and try to help for ordinary hospitals. And for example, a trade union, Doctor Alliance, try to help for hospital and try to attract attention of society for this problem on hospitals, on Russian hospitals, because unfortunately Putin regime to spend money for propaganda machine, for wars, for example, against Ukraine, and for other disgusting needs. But we don't have a normal budget for medicine needs, for education. And of course, result of that disgusting policy is a horrible situation with hospitals. And activists try to share information about that, but fake news to publish information, it's not true. It's very good condition of hospitals, and we have a very good result of our process on our hospitals, but in reality it's not true. And we have a lot of cases arrested of activists who only try to bring masks and some equipment to hospitals. And and some of activists who try to share information about real situation of hospitals to have a problem with police now. And of course, it's not only problem with fake news. We have a problem with impact from side of Putin authorities to activists. But it's really fantastic news that people don't stop their activity. They continue to help for other peoples. They continue to bring to hospitals masks and other equipment and continue this volunteers activity. It's really a very inspiring trend, I think. Then people don't afraid Putin's authorities and continue their activity, and it's really very great news from Russia.
That's really inspiring and incredible. And Evgenia, we haven't been able to speak to you for very long, but I'm so happy that we could have you even for 2 minutes. I've said it to you before, and I'll just say it to the audience. Evgenia has so much knowledge about Russia. Russia is a very big country, and it's a very complicated country too. But every time I speak to her, despite the tremendous attacks that she herself has faced, she always leaves me feeling so hopeful, because there really is something in people power and the fact that people will not be silenced, and that, you remember that it is our voice. So as we're very strapped for time here, I would just encourage all of you to really visit her website, activatica.org, and hear more about her. And I know she'd be willing to speak to all of you. But Evgenia, thank you so much for joining us. I do believe we are going to leave you now with a video from Ariel, who also couldn't join us today, but was another voice that we wanted. And at least for the audience watching, you will have heard a little snippet from each of them. And then they're all available to speak to you afterwards. So thank you, Evgenia. And here is Ariel.
Thank you.
My name is Ariel Ruiz Urquiola. I am doctor in biological science, but for the Cuban regime, I am only one farmer. So right now I have corrupted my computer. So for that reason, I cannot participate in real time in that kind of workshop. So then I want to speak about one of my main topics into the environmental activities. So from 1998, I started to work with sea turtle, in particular with the biological conservation topic of that kind of marine research as a university student. So from 2001, I started to work as a professional with that kind of marine research, trying to look in the information about one special topic. The Cuban regime was the last country that feature in legal way that kind of marine research, and the goal of that kind of feature was to make one international trade to Japan to sell the turtle shells. So then my goal was, as a research, to know the genetic composition of the fishery stock. Then the idea for the Cuban regime was to justify that the genetic composition of the fishery stock belonged to the hawksbill that born in the Cuban beaches. But nevertheless, our results were totally different. So the majority of the hawksbill that the Cuban regime featured in legal way born in beaches from Mexican Gulf and also in Mona Island, Puerto Rico. So then when I published together with my student all those results in one international congress from Mexico, then the Cuban regime decided to attack me for the second time, and then they kicked me out from Havana University, and they prohibited me to continue working with sea turtle. But at the same time, at least they stopped it for full-time the legal fishery of that kind of marine research in my country. Although that I could not continue working, knowing more about the biologies and the conservation of that kind of marine research, the illegal fishery in my country continued. So I tried to make several efforts to control and to know the real cause of that kind of illegal fishery. And then I knew that the majority of the fishermen settlement, they did not have enough food to eat. So then one another problem came. So how I felt at that time without many resources to manage that kind of problem, because how I could say to the fishery families, you cannot fish that kind of animal because it's in the danger of extinction and you don't have enough food for to eat. So then it was a big problem for us. And on the other hand, the most interesting thing was that the fishermen, they made that kind of illegal activity not only for to eat for survival. The goal was to sell the meat and the turtle shell to the tourists that visited the country. And so then I knew that the real problem was not to eat, it was not to take meat for to eat or to take eggs for to eat. It was to obtain money for to buy shoes, for to buy dresses, for to buy another kind of food to survive, also to repay the houses. So then the problem became more deep until now. Why? Because I could not do so much as a researcher. Because first, the Cuban dictatorship decided to stop my research activities, and then I became a farmer. And then on the other hand, that became one real problem for the Cuban government. So the Cuban staff from the government should give another way to survival to that kind of people. But the Cuban regime always plays in double face. So they try to show one face about the conservation of the environment to the tourism and to the European countries, but on the other face, they try to obtain money and to pressure the local people. So that was the main topic that I got it. So the second topic, I don't know if I will have time for to speak. That is the problem that I got when I tried to make my biofarm in one national park from the western part of Cuba, that the name is Viñales. And then I tried to make the biofarm, and the Cuban dictatorship put me in jail for 1 year, only because I tried to protect the natural resource in combination with the sustainable management of the animals and plants for that kind of national park. So how I could not continue working as a researcher in my country, in Cuba, I decided to become a farmer, because farmer is like the basis on the pyramids, in the social pyramid of my country. No one want to do. No one want to become a farmer. Is considered that the basic job without any kind of salary or remuneration from the Cuban government. And so in the socialism system, normally the private properties does not exist. So always you will depend of the government for to sell, for to buy, to acquire, for to work. But anyway, I decided to make the biofarm. And I started to make one smart plant nursery to preserve the genetic background of one special timber tree. So the name is mahogany. So the scientific name, Suetenia mahagoni, is considered like the best wood in the world. And the main wild population were in my country, but nowadays you cannot find really so many mature individuals in the wood, because the majority of the local farmers and also the government logging for to sell the wood. Then I tried to make that kind of biofarm, and then I knew also that some kind of farmer started to breed wild pig using the natural resource from the national park. And then when I showed to the local authority what was happening in a real way in the national park, they started to attack me using the political police again for the second time. And then one day they came to my farm, and I was making one alive fence, so using a live trunk to propagate it, some special of trees. And they say that I did not have permission to do that, and they put me in prison for 1 year. So since that at that moment I have one wristed handy, I could record the conversation in between the political police and myself. And then, thanks to that kind of record, can use for the international communities of environmental activists to press on the Cuban government to give me the freedom. So the Cuban government or regime never gave me that kind of condition. So they put me out to the prison after one hunger and thirst strike for more than 16 days. And they put me out to the prison with one special status that was extra penalizing. So that is a little bit crazy, but extra penalizing in the communist system means that you can continue in jail but in your house. So you cannot move, you cannot do nothing without any permission, and of course you cannot continue working as a farmer or as a real profession. Thanks for that opportunity for communicating with you and to try to explain the situation of my country and in particular my person.